Henry VIII is known as one of the most infamous monarchs of England, a physically towering figure with a dominating personality. Henry's life was all about breaking the barriers imposed on him by his position, regardless of cost. His desire to impose his will above all others saw him clash with the powerful Pope, reshape the role of the monarchy, and change the way England practiced religion forever. His fickle relationship with his wives and mistresses sprang so many scandals and intrigue. It is probably one of the key reasons his rule is still talked about today. In this video, we will investigate the life of Henry VIII and why his rule was regarded so. Henry was born on 28 June 1491 in Greenwich, London. He was the second son and third child of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Much of Henry's childhood was spent in the care of his grandmother, the Lady Margaret Beaufort. The Lady Margaret was an influential figure in young Henry's life. As the mother of her only child, Henry VII, she was fiercely protective of her small family. She was also a deeply religious woman who encouraged her grandson to follow the strict religious codes that she lived by. Young Henry, in the meantime, took a liking to writing and learning languages. He became fluent in Latin and French at a young age. He was said to have been adept at hunting, jousting, and archery. He was even interested in astronomy. Henry VII had ascended the throne on the back of victory after the long years of the War of the Roses. The conflict saw 3 decades of war between the royal houses of Lancaster and York. His marriage with Elizabeth of York and victory on the battlefield had ended the war. However, political disputes and fragile loyalties remained. Henry and his older brother Arthur were expected to strengthen the Tudor lines of succession through political marriages. Henry VII deemed it vital that they produce male heirs that would strengthen the Tudor claim to the throne. Outside of England, Henry VII had wanted to strengthen the alliance between England and Spain through political marriage. He arranged a union between Prince Arthur and Princess Catherine of Aragon. Aragon was a medieval kingdom located in the Iberian Peninsula and is part of modern-day Spain. Princess Catherine was the daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile, making her a powerful match for Prince Arthur. Prince Arthur and Princess Catherine would marry in 1502, and the alliance between the two powers became firm. Tragically, the marriage between the two royal teenagers proved to be very short-lived. Prince Arthur would die a few months later of the sweating disease pandemic that ravaged England. With his successor dead, Henry VII fell into grief and despair. The sudden loss of his eldest son had thrown into disarray his plans to cement the Tudor grasp on power. He was reluctant to offer the younger Henry as another match to Princess Catherine, as canon law forbade the marriage between a man and his brother's widow, unless it was approved by the Pope himself. While still mourning the loss of his elder brother, the 10-year-old Henry was confronted with the death of his mother. Elizabeth of York had given birth to a daughter named Catherine. Sadly, the newborn would die after just a few days, and Elizabeth would succumb to an infection from her pregnancy just a week later. Henry was named Prince of Wales and the Earl of Chester shortly thereafter. He took on the full responsibilities of a king in waiting. In 1509, King Henry VII died, and Henry succeeded him as King Henry VIII just a few weeks shy of his 18th birthday. The new king quickly moved to establish himself by picking himself a wife. Breaking with norms and bureaucracy, Henry VIII disregarded his father's wishes and married his brother's widow, Princess Catherine of Aragon. On the 11th of June 1509, the pair married at the Queen's Closet in Greenwich. Queen Catherine was described as a deeply pious woman who rose at midnight to recite prayers and fasted regularly. By all accounts, She was a dutiful and humble queen who took it upon herself to run the royal household. Furthermore, she would spend much of her time and money on charitable works, which won her the adoration of the English public. The early years of marriage between Henry VIII and Queen Catherine was said to be a happy and joyous time for the pair. Henry would spend much of his time with Catherine at the lavish Greenwich Palace. The Tudor kings exercised complete control over the government during this period in history. The king's authority was second only to God, and Parliament acted only on his will. As such, his palaces and courts became the seat of government wherever he went. Henry VIII believed in showcasing the wealth and power of England for all to see. He would host massive and grand balls with foreign dignitaries, ministers, and English nobles as he tried to live up to the demands of his new position. The scale of these expensive festivities would only grow as Henry aged. Garden parties in Greenwich Palace and Hampton Court were aplenty. Henry himself enjoyed mingling with his guests, indulging in rich food and drink late into the night. He particularly loved dancing, gaiety, and the pursuit of other scandalous gentlemanly pleasures. Henry VII, however, displayed an aversion to the business of governing. He hated paperwork, writing letters, and could only be persuaded to deal with diplomatic issues when his ministers insisted on it. As such, governing the kingdom was left in the hands of his ministers and officers, allowing them to consolidate their own power and influence over matters of state. Queen Catherine knew Henry VIII expected her to have a son to solidify the Tudor line succession for the English throne. Soon after her marriage, she became pregnant, but the pregnancy tragically ended with a stillborn baby girl. She would get pregnant again and, much to Henry's delight, gave birth to a baby boy, Henry Tudor, on the 1st of January 1511. The couple's joy, however, would not last long. The boy died just 52 days later of abdominal complications. Henry VIII and Queen Catherine were devastated. Queen Catherine would deliver stillborn babies in 1514 and 1515. The following year, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl and named her Mary. Whilst glad of Mary's birth, she was not the son Henry was looking for. Henry Tudor's untimely and tragic death and Queen Catherine's tendency to give birth to girls seems to have convinced Henry that she would never be able to provide him with a healthy male heir, and exacerbated his paranoia. Henry was a well-built, tall, and handsome man in a powerful position, and it was not hard to see why women in court and beyond were attracted to him. Henry himself did little to discourage the opposite sex's desire for him, and had a lengthy affair with Queen Catherine's maid of honor, Elizabeth Blount. Queen Catherine knew about the affair but appeared to accept it. As Henry's love and desire for her waned as the years went by, she increasingly turned to prayer and caring for her daughter Mary as distraction. All the while, she kept to her oaths as a dutiful wife. Meanwhile, Pope Julius II had increased tensions between the feuding European powers by withdrawing the French King Louis XIII's title as Most Pious King and giving it to Henry. Henry wanted to reclaim the French lands that were held by his predecessor, Henry V, and signed a pact against France with Catherine's father, Ferdinand of Aragon. On the 30th of June 1513, Henry VIII crossed the English Channel and invaded France. While Henry was campaigning in France, James IV of Scotland decided to take advantage of his absence and invaded England from the north to show support for his French allies. Hoping to secure support for a pretender to the English throne named Perkin Warbeck, he marched south, destroying several castles on his way. Queen Catherine rose to England's defense and rallied what forces that remained to intercept the Scottish. During the Battle of Flodden on the 9th of September 1513, the English army dealt a crushing defeat to the Scottish. James IV was killed during the battle, and the Scottish retreated. Meanwhile, Henry's invasion of France was going terribly. The support he was promised from Ferdinand of Aragon never materialized, and many of his men fell sick. He plundered what lands he could and fled to England. Now weakened, Henry VIII had no choice but to sue for peace. He offered his 18-year-old sister, Mary, to the 52-year-old Louis XII, which helped secure peace between the two countries for 8 years. In 1520, Henry VIII began an affair with Mary Boleyn, the daughter of the Earl of Wiltshire. The affair produced 2 children, including a son. However, Henry never acknowledged them as his legitimate children, as Mary was already married to another man. Furthermore, it was Mary Boleyn's sister that seemed to have really caught Henry's attention. Anne Boleyn was an attractive young woman who shared Henry's love for the arts and dance. She sought the glamorous opulence and social delights of the English courts that Henry oversaw. She had spent several years in the French courts, where it was rumored she took on many lovers. For a while, Anne rejected Henry's advances, as she saw how quickly he jumped from lover to lover. Yet, she eventually succumbed to Henry's charms and his relentless efforts to woo her. Meanwhile, Henry's affair with Elizabeth Blount had produced a son in 1519. The boy's name was Henry Fitzroy, and Henry appeared to show genuine love for the boy. However, Henry Fitzroy was not a legitimate claimant to the throne, as he was produced out of wedlock. In a sign that he was losing faith of gaining a male heir from Catherine, he elevated him to the position of Duke of Richmond and Earl of Nottingham. It was a signal to the rest of England that he was of noble blood and of the appropriate high status, even though the move did not make him a direct claimant to the throne. 38-year-old Queen Catherine, on the other hand, had turned menopause. Unable to produce any more children, she and her daughter Mary spent less time with the king than ever before. Her influence waned as the power-hungry factions in courts shunned her, seeing that she had lost the king's favor. In 1527, Henry openly told her that he wanted their marriage annulled and had written to the Pope, the only authority who had the power to carry out the annulment. He argued that he sinned by marrying his brother's wife, which led God to punish him with no male heirs. He tasked his Lord Chancellor, Thomas Wolsey, with ensuring that the annulment was given. The chief advisor to the king, Wolsey was also a Catholic cardinal and was well acquainted with matters of religion and state. Wolsey was to be the chief negotiator and put forth Henry's argument with the Pope. The Pope sent Cardinal Campeggio from Italy to hear Henry's case and reach a decision. Wolsey and Henry presented their arguments to the cardinal at the Legatine court. After several weeks of passionate debate and strong opposition to the annulment by Queen Catherine, the case was adjourned to the Pope in Rome, where it remained with no resolution in sight. Henry blamed Wolsey for the failure and charged him with treason. Wolsey would die of natural causes while awaiting trial. This attempt at annulment came to be known as Henry's Great Matter. It divided opinion in Henry's court and the church. It was at this juncture that Henry would meet Thomas Cranmer, a relatively obscure cleric who gained Henry's favor through his passionate defense of Henry's position. Henry would also find a new and capable ally in his own courts. Thomas Cromwell started his service as a collector of revenues, but would work his way up to the king's privy council. He filled the late Wolsey's shoes and made himself indispensable to the king, earning the title of chief minister. Queen Catherine was essentially exiled to Moor and forced to live separately from her daughter Mary. Her attempts to contact the Spanish ambassador and her family in Spain were refused or blocked. She was spied upon, and her movements were severely restricted. Anne Boleyn was also increasingly seen by Henry's side, decked with jewelries and gowns that Henry had confiscated from Catherine. Anne Boleyn was given the noble title of Lady Marquess of Pembroke. However, Henry VIII was also aware that Queen Catherine still had popular support and kept Anne away from public engagements. In January 1533, Henry VIII found out that Anne was pregnant. Hoping for a son and to ensure that the child was not born out of wedlock like Henry Fitzroy, Henry married Anne in secret. In March 1533, Thomas Cranmer was consecrated as the Archbishop of Canterbury. In his pledge of oath, he declared that he would not be bound by any authority that contradicted the law of England or God. In essence, he swore loyalty to Henry over the Pope, as Henry's word was England's law. In 23 May of 1533, Thomas Cranmer annulled Henry's 24-year marriage to Catherine of Aragon because Catherine had previously married Henry's brother, Arthur. 5 days later, he would declare Henry's marriage to Anne as valid and official. Decked in all the splendor of English royalty, Anne Boleyn was coronated as England's queen on the 1st of June 1533. The news of her ascension was met with bewilderment by the English public, many whom still believed Catherine was still queen. Her procession through London on her way to coronation was described as having the atmosphere of a funeral. Queen Anne was said to be severely displeased that Londoners had not removed their hats in respect as her procession passed by. Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell pressured Henry to break away from the Pope and establish his own church in England. Henry VIII, despite being a devout Catholic, eventually relented. In 1534, the English Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which declared Henry VIII to be the supreme leader of the English Church, thus severing ties to the Pope in Rome. Anne Boleyn gave birth to Elizabeth, her first child, in September 1533. While displeased by the sex of the baby, Henry VIII nonetheless showed affection for the child and believed Anne would give him a son in due time. However, this complicated matters with Catherine's daughter, Mary. To establish clear lines of succession, Henry renounced Mary as his daughter and had her move residences often. Mary had been separated from her mother for years now and suffered from ill health. She eventually became part of Elizabeth's household, where she was said to be often mistreated by Queen Anne's supporters. It was at this time that Henry returned to his adulterous ways and took another mistress. The affair shocked Queen Anne, as the couple had only been married for a little more than a year. The fact that Henry was so openly having an affair greatly strained the relationship between them. Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn also complicated matters on the diplomatic front. In 1534, the new King of France, Francis I, sent an envoy to propose marriage. The terms offered the hand of Dauphin, Francis's son, to Mary, Catherine's daughter. This deliberate snub of Elizabeth greatly angered Queen Anne and frustrated Henry's attempts to pursue an alliance with France. To make matters worse, Henry's exile and mistreatment of his former wife, Catherine, had soured relations with her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. In early 1536, Catherine passed away and Henry appeared to have been genuinely affected by the loss. Nonetheless, he hoped that her death would mark a new chapter in England's relationship with the Holy Roman Empire. On January 24, 1536, Henry suffered a serious jousting accident at Greenwich Palace, which saw him violently unhorsed. Records on the severity of the incident differ. Some say that Henry was unconscious for 2 hours, and it was feared he would die. Others say that Henry VIII walked off his injuries and appeared unharmed. Historians speculate Henry most likely suffered a brain injury that severely altered his moods and behavior. After the incident, the 44-year-old Henry became increasingly triggered, suspicious, and prone to meting out harsh punishment. He also became much less physically active, which affected his weight. At the time of Henry's accident, Queen Anne was pregnant. The news that Henry may have died appeared to have deeply upset the Queen, who suffered a miscarriage, her second in 2 years as a result. Despite the terrible circumstances of the miscarriage, Henry put the blame squarely at her feet and saw it as a sign of God's displeasure. Queen Anne had not delivered her his son, put a strain on his diplomatic relations, and had become an impediment to Henry's succession plans. Henry approached his closest advisor, Thomas Cromwell, and tasked him with finding a way to dissolve the marriage. The opportunistic Henry Cromwell saw this as a chance to grow his own power in court by ridding himself of the Boleyn faction aligned with the Queen once and for all. He also felt that they no longer represented England's or the King's best interests. Cromwell gathered his spies and launched a special commission to investigate claims of treason against Anne Boleyn. On the 30th of April 1536, Thomas Cromwell presented evidence that was highly likely to be fabricated to Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery with certain members of the King's Privy Chamber, including her brother, George Boleyn. She was also accused of regicide in order to rule England as regent. She was arrested and sent to the Tower Green to await judgment. It is highly likely that Anne Boleyn was also pregnant at this time, something both Henry and Cromwell were aware of. Her alleged lovers were executed on the 17th of May. At the age of 36, Anne Boleyn was executed by beheading on the 19th of May. Historians would later uncover evidence that Henry planned the details of her execution meticulously himself. 10 days later, Henry VIII would marry his mistress, Jane Seymour, at the Queen's Closet in Whitehall. Jane Seymour was the opposite of Anne Boleyn in character. Jane was described as a quiet, submissive, and conciliatory figure. She helped Henry reconcile with his 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. They were welcomed back to court soon after. On July 1536, Henry VIII suffered a personal tragedy when his son, the Duke of Richmond, Henry Fitzroy, died of tuberculosis at the age of 17. Henry was said to be devastated. He was close to his son and had considered Henry Fitzroy his heir, even though he was not in the official line of succession. Yet on 12 October 1537, Henry finally got the male heir he was praying for. Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy baby boy named Edward, much to the delight of Henry and the rest of England. Tragically, however, Henry's joy was short-lived. Jane would die due to an infection from her pregnancy on the 24th of October that year. A heartbroken Henry ordered 3 weeks of mourning. It was also a period of religious upheaval in England. With the passing of the Act of Supremacy in 1634, Henry had essentially declared himself above the Pope. Now excommunicated from the Church by the Pope for his act, Henry had free reign with the churches and monasteries in the country. In a bid to boost the treasuries of the crown, Cromwell, with Henry's approval, ordered for an evaluation of the taxable value of all the church's holdings in England, Wales, and English-controlled parts of Ireland. This survey, which would become known as Valor Excellicia Siticus, estimated that the lands owned by the church alone would bring £120,000 a year. This would be equal to £36 million today. By 1538, most of the monasteries and abbeys in the country were shut down and their assets seized. The parishioners whom lived there were forced to retire with pensions. These monasteries and abbeys were deemed as pro-pope institutions which were siphoning money to the Vatican. Now they would help fill the royal coffers instead. Land confiscated from the church was redistributed by a special court called the Court of Augmentations. The vast lands that were given out to lords, knights, and professional men such as doctors and merchants resulted in a massive wealth shift in England's social structure. With new wealth and lands, the English who benefited renewed their loyalty to Henry with fresh enthusiasm. A new religious doctrine of 10 articles was also introduced for the English Church. The doctrine signaled that Henry VIII, while being a devout Catholic, appeared to be willing to accommodate the demands of the new Protestant movement. Those who refused to do the traditional Catholic rites were allowed to do so, albeit in secrecy. However, these reforms did not sit well with some. In the country's north, where conservative Catholicism was more entrenched and wealth redistribution had little impact, people revolted against the king. In the uprising in what became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, 40,000 men and women marched against the religious policies of the crown and supporters of Thomas Cromwell. Many of the rebellion's leaders were Catholic priests who had lost influence with the reforms. The rebellion disbanded when the king appeared to agree to their demands. However, shortly thereafter, Henry had the leaders of the movements arrested and executed. Thousands of more rebels would suffer the same fate as the arrests continued. In 1539, the English Parliament passed the Act of the Six Articles and enshrined the new doctrines into law. The Act, for the first time in history, allowed for the individual ownership of the Holy Bible. Access to the Scriptures and the freedom to interpret them had huge ramifications for life in England. Religious reform aside, it was deemed necessary that Henry VIII find himself another wife after Jane Seymour's death. Thomas Cromwell pushed for marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves, the 25-year-old daughter of the Duke of Cleves. Anne's sister was married to John Frederick, the head of the Protestant Confederation in Germany. Cromwell argued that such a match would improve England's strained alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. Henry came away from his first meeting with Anne thoroughly unimpressed, but went ahead with the wedding to avoid hostilities with the Duke of Cleves. Anne was educated in Germany and thus did not speak English fluently. She was also not interested in dance or music and appeared to be sexually inexperienced. Henry and Anne were not a happy couple. Henry fell in love with another woman, the 16-year-old Catherine Howard, in April 1539, determined to end the marriage. Henry and Anne mutually agreed to testify that the marriage had not been consummated. This made the annulment smoother, and they parted amicably, with Anne receiving a large compensation of land and money for her troubles. By 1539, the relationship between Henry VIII and Cromwell had deteriorated. Henry blamed his chief minister for the Pilgrimage of Grace and the annulment of his marriage to Anne of Cleves. Cromwell's enemies, among them the Duke of Norfolk, whispered in the king's ear that he was now plotting treason. On 10 June 1540, while making his way to a meeting, Cromwell was arrested by the king's guards. He was accused of plotting to overthrow the king and marry his daughter, the Lady Mary. From the Tower of London, Cromwell repeatedly wrote letters to the king, beseeching him to pardon him. His pleas were ignored, and Thomas Cromwell was executed on 28 July. It is said Henry VIII regretted the execution soon after, as Cromwell had proven to be such a brilliant administrator and faithful servant that no one was able to replace him. On the same day of Cromwell's execution, the 49-year-old Henry VIII married 16-year-old Catherine Howard in secret. Catherine Howard was Anne Boleyn's first cousin and the niece of the Duke of Norfolk. The Duke and his Howard allies rose rapidly in court with his niece's marriage, and were known for their religious conservatism. The new queen, however, made a fatal misstep when she carried out an affair with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper, with the help of her maids of honor. This affair was caught on by the opponents of the Duke, namely Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. The former cardinal who had helped Henry annul his marriage to Anne was a religious reformist and sought to undermine the conservative faction in court. The archbishop went to Henry with news of the affair. He also accused her private secretary Francis Dereham, of being her former lover. Catherine Howard was arrested together with Culpeper and Dereham. Catherine insisted that Francis had forced himself upon her before her marriage, and that she was an innocent. Under torture and duress, Dereham outed the affair between Culpeper and Catherine. Culpeper and Dereham were beheaded. Their heads were put on spikes and displayed at the London Bridge for the next 4 years. On February 1542, the English Parliament passed an Act of Attainder that declared it was treason for a woman to marry the king while concealing her previous love affairs. The 17-year-old Catherine Howard was beheaded at the Tower Green on 13 February. Henry also had his share of international issues to deal with. By 1542, England's tumultuous relationship with Scotland had broken down further with Henry's break from the Roman Catholic Church. James V, the King of Scotland, refused to break away from the Church despite repeated attempts by Henry to make him do so. Henry wanted to join his new ally, Charles V of the Roman Holy Empire, in his war with the French King Francis I and the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman I. However, he had to ensure Scottish resistance was crushed before he could do so. Hence, in 1542, he invaded Scotland. The English invasion culminated in the Battle of Solway Moss, when English forces numbering 3,000 faced a Scottish force of 15,000. The English crushed the Scottish in a great triumph for Henry VIII. The outcome drove James V to despair, and he would die of cholera just months after the battle. With James V dead, Henry V was confident that the sole heir of the Scottish throne, a week-old baby named Mary, would have little choice but to marry his son, Edward, and abandon the Catholic Church when she came of age. In 1543, Henry married his sixth wife, Catherine Parr. Catherine was a wealthy widow of 30 years of age. She was described as a natural peacekeeper, and Henry was said to genuinely enjoy her company. She helped to repair Henry's relationship with Mary and Elizabeth. All of them celebrated Christmas together for the first time in 1543. Catherine was also an intelligent woman, with reformist views on religion and education. She persuaded Henry to invest in England's education. Henry rebuilt Wolsey's Cardinal College as Christ Church College in Oxford after it was neglected from 1525. He also opened Trinity College in Cambridge and introduced subjects such as civil law, divinity, and medicine. In 1544, with the Scots defeated, Henry VIII launched his final invasion of France at the age of 53. Before leaving England, Henry brought Elizabeth and Mary back to the line of succession by making Parliament pass the Act of Succession. They would now only be behind Prince Edward and his heirs in the succession line. Despite being in poor health, the field of war appeared to invigorate Henry with energy and focus. He laid siege to Boulogne and defeated the French army stationed there on 14 September. However, by now, Charles V had abandoned the alliance with Henry and negotiated a peace treaty with Francis I. Henry found himself fighting the French on their home turf, alone. In July 1545, French ships outflanked Henry and attempted to land troops on the Isle of Wight in England. They withdrew at tremendous cost to the English, with the loss of the battleship Mary Rose and the 600 men on board. With his army spread thin and treasury close to depletion, Henry abandoned the campaign and returned to England. Upon his return, Henry's health took a turn for the worst. He was tortured by feverish joint pain and became bedridden. He suffered from depression and would spend most of his waking hours in the company of his doctors, who were unable to find a cure. His temper became extremely volatile in these final days, and many were arrested and executed on the slightest hint of treason. Henry VIII died on 28 January 1547 of a suspected pulmonary embolism. His son Edward would succeed him on the 31st of January. Henry's long and bloody reign had huge ramifications for the future of religion and society in England. Henry VIII was a man chained to his own passions, wants, and desires, caring little for the outcomes and enacting great societal changes just to get his way. The scandals, politicking, and backstabbing so prevalent in the English courts during his reign had enough material to be made into many shows and movies in the modern age. It is somewhat deserving that Henry VIII's reputation is mainly associated with the fate of his wives. This is best encapsulated by a nursery rhyme English schoolchildren used to sing about Henry's wives. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived.